Today we're going to be talking about solving quadratics. Continue. First thing I want to discuss is factoring. For this problem, it says to solve the quadratics with the perfect square trinomials. If I notice, these are going to be a perfect square trinomial. Well, two factors of 49 that will add to give me 14 is 7 and 7. So that means I'm going to have it written as x plus 7 equals 4. Because x plus 7 and x plus 7 repeats, I can rewrite it as x plus 7 squared equals 4. From here, solving is pretty simple. To get rid of a square, square root both sides, so that my square root and the square cancels out. So I'm left with x plus 7 equals. Anytime I square root a number, I'm going to have two answers, a positive and a negative. The square root of 4 is 2. So you can split this up into two answers. X plus 7 equals positive 2. X plus 7 equals negative 2. Subtract 7 from both sides, and I get x equals negative 5. Subtract 7 from both sides, x equals negative 9. That is how you do this problem. Same thing for number 2. They are perfect square trinomials. Factors of 9 that will add to give me 6. Well, 3 and 3, but they have to be negative because it has to equal negative 6. So I'm going to have x minus 3 times x minus 3 equals 20. X minus 3 squared equals 20. Square root both sides, and you're left with x minus 3 equals plus or minus square root of 20. For this problem, you're going to have x minus 3 equals plus square root of 20. X minus 3 equals negative square root of 20. Add 3 to both sides, and you get x equals 3 plus square root of 20. That is not your final answer. Square root of 20 can simplify. So because the square root of 20 can simplify, you can take 20 and split it up. A perfect square that will go into 20 is 4 times 5. The square root of 4 is 2. Square root of 5 is the square root of 5. So it's going to be 3 plus 2 square root of 5. That is the simplified answer. So I have to do the same thing to this side. So add 3 to both sides so that my 3's cancel out. X equals 3 minus square root of 20. Well, square root of 20 is still going to be x equals 3 minus 2 square root of 5. So this is your final answer. This is going to be really helpful when completing the square. To complete the square, it is possible to take any quadratic equation and create a perfect square trinomial. And you're going to solve it the similar way. This method is called completing the square. Step 1 is to rewrite as ax squared plus bx equals c. Divide both sides by a so that it becomes x squared plus bx equals c. Complete the square by taking half of b square it, and add it to both sides. This looks very similar to vertex form. Factor the perfect square trinomial. Take the square root of both sides. Thus, this will create two cases because a square root has both a positive and negative value. Solve both equations, simplify. That seems like a lot of steps, so we're going to break it down into one by one. So the first step is to rewrite it as ax squared plus bx equals c. So my first step is to subtract the c from both sides. So if it's positive 56, I'm going to subtract negative 56. So that I'm left with x squared minus 18x equals negative 56. Divide both sides by a. Well, in this case, a is 1. So if I divide anything by 1, it's not going to change anything. So that step's done. So I did step 1 and I did step 2. Complete the square by taking half of b. So a was here, b is here. So I'm going to do negative 18, and taking half means I'm going to just divide by 2. And I get negative 9. Square it, so negative 9 squared is equal to 81. From here, it says add it to both sides. So I'm going to have x squared minus 18x plus 81 equals negative 56 plus 81, because I have to add it to both sides. Once you add it to both sides, I'm done with step 3. Step 4 says to factor. So I'm going to factor this, just like I did in the warm-up. Factors of 81, that will add to give me 18. Well, 9 times 9 is 81. Add them together to get negative 18. They both have to be negative. So it's going to be x minus 9 times x minus 9 equals 25, I believe. Yes, 25. Rewrite this as x minus 9 squared equals 25. Solve. Square root both sides. X minus 9 equals plus or minus 5. The square root of 25 is 5. So I've done step 4, and I've just completed step 5. So the next step is to finish solving. So I'm going to have x minus 9 equals positive 5. X minus 9 equals negative 5. Add 9 to both sides, and I get x equals 14. Add 9 to both sides, x equals 4. That is how you solve by completing the square. You can also see it written as something like this. They both mean the same answer. So let's look at number 4. Number 4, step 1 is to always rewrite it so that it looks like ax squared plus bx equals c. Well, if I look at my problem, it already looks like that. So step 1, done. Divide both sides by a so that it looks like x squared plus bx equals c. So because a is 2, I'm dividing everything by 2. So 2 divided by 2 is x squared. Negative 16 divided by 2 is positive 8x equals negative 30 divided by 2 is negative 15. Step 2, done. Complete the square by taking half of b. Remember, a B, C. So I'm taking negative 8, divide by 2, and I get negative 4. Square it. Negative 4 squared is positive 16. So that when I factor, or I add it in, I'm going to have x squared minus 8x plus 16 equals negative 15 plus 16. Factor. So I completed step 3, now I have to factor. Factors of 16 that will add to give me 8. Well, in this case, it's going to be 4 and 4, but it's negative 8, so they have to be negative. So I'm going to have x minus 4 equals 1, because negative 15 plus 16 equals 1. X minus 4 squared equals 1, because they're the same, so I can combine them. Square root both sides. X minus 4 equals 1, positive, negative, because the square root of 1 is 1. So I'm going to have x minus 4 equals 1. X minus 4 equals negative 1. Add 4. X equals 5. Add 4. X equals 3. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. Let's look at the next problem. Step 1. Make sure that it looks like ax squared plus bx equals c. Step 1, check. Step 2 is to divide by a. So in this case, I'm going to divide by 4. 4 divided by 4 is 1, so I'm going to have x squared minus 8 divided by 4 is 2x equals negative 3 over 4. That does not simplify, so it has to stay like that. Take b, negative 2, divide by 2, negative 1. Square it, I get positive 1. So I'm going to have x squared minus 2x plus 1 equals negative 3/4 plus 1. Factor. Factors of 1 that will add to give me negative 2. Well, factors of 1 is 1 and 1. Because negative 2 is negative, they have to be negative. So it's going to be x minus 1, x minus 1, negative 3/4 plus 1 is going to leave me with a positive 1/4. Combine your factors. X minus 1 squared equals 1/4. Square root both sides. X minus 1 equals positive or negative. I'm going to make a side note. Square root of 1 over 4 is the same thing as the square root of 1 divided by the square root of 4. Well, you know that the square root of 1 is 1, and the square root of 4 is 2. So this answer right here is positive and negative 1/2. Split it up. X minus 1 equals 1/2. X minus 1 equals negative 1/2. Add 1 to both sides, and you get x equals 1 and 1/2. Add 1 to both sides, and you get x equals 1/2. There's many ways you could have wrote this. You can write it as x equals 1 and 1/2. you could have wrote it as x equals 1.5, comma, a half. Or you could have written it as x equals 3/2, comma, 1/2. Either answer would have been accepted. Number 6. First, I have to get it to where all my x's are on one side. So that means I have to subtract 8 from both sides. So that I get 3x squared plus 10x equals negative 8. So this is putting all the steps together. Now, because my a is 3, I have to divide everything by 3. So that I get x squared plus 10/3 x equals negative 8 over 3. From here, I have to take the 10/3 and divide by 2. Remember, anytime you have a fraction and you're dividing by another number, it's really 10/3 times 1/2. So this is the same thing as this. So 10 times 1 is 10. 3 times 2 is 6. And 10 over 6 reduces to 5/3. So once you divide by 2, you now have to square it. 5/3 squared. 5 squared is 25. 3 squared is 9. So I'm now going to add this in to my formula. X squared plus 10/3 x plus 25 over 9 equals negative 8/3 plus 25 over 9. If you've noticed, every time we got this number right here, it was the same as that number. Don't believe me? Let's go look at the other two. Negative 4, negative 4. Negative 9, negative 9. So when we factor this, all you have to do is say x plus 5/3 squared equals negative 8 over 3 plus 25 over 9 simplified. When you simplify that, you should have gotten 1 over 9. Now, square root both sides. So that I get x plus 5/3 equals square root of 1 over square root of 9, which equals plus or minus 1/3. So I'm going to have x plus 5/3 equals 1/3. X plus 5/3 equals negative 1/3. Subtract 5/3 from both sides. X equals 1 minus 5, negative 4/3. Subtract 5/3 from both sides. And I get x equals negative 6. I don't know why I wrote 6. That should have been a 3/3, which reduces to negative 2. So your final answer should have been negative 4/3, comma, negative 2. That one was a little tricky. So if you got lost somewhere, please raise your hand if you need help. Or you can pause the video and go back to where you got lost. Number 7 is adding another little step. That you have numbers on both sides. But we still only want the x's on the left side. So I have to move the 21 over. To move 21 over, I'm going to add it to both sides. X squared plus 16x equals 16. Take 16, divide by 2, you get 8. 8 squared is 64. Add it in. X squared plus 16x plus 64 equals 16 plus 64. Factor. X plus 8 squared equals 80. Square root both sides. And you're left with x plus 8 equals plus or minus the square root of 80. Break it up. I'm going to pull the square root of 80 up here so I can help try to factor the square root of 80 because it will simplify. A perfect square that will go into 80 is 16. I believe this is the biggest one. So 16 and 5. The square root of 16 is 4. Square root of 5 is 5. So here I'm going to subtract 8 from both sides. And I'm left with x equals negative 8 plus 4 square root of 5. Subtract 8 from both sides. And I'm left with x equals negative 8 minus 4 square root of 5. So that is my final answer. Number 8. Okay, all my numbers have been moved over. So I'm going to divide both sides by 3. So that I get x squared. I'm going to change color so it doesn't get mixed up with the previous problem. So that I get x squared minus 10x equals 23. Take my b, divide by 2. Square it, and I get 25. So I'm going to have x squared minus 10x plus 25 equals 23 plus 25. Factor, and I'm going to get x minus 5 squared equals 48. Square root both sides. And I'm going to get x minus 5 equals plus or minus the square root of 48. 48 is not a perfect square, but it will simplify. So I'm going to have x minus 5 equals positive square root of 48, and x minus 5 equals negative square root of 48. Well, the square root of 48, a perfect square that will go into both, or that will go into 48, again, is 16. 16 times 3 will give me 48. So square root of both. Square root of 16 is 4. Square root of 3 is the square root of 3. So add 5 to both sides. and I get x equals 5 plus 4 square root of 3. Add 5 to both sides, and you get x equals 5 minus 4 square root of 3. So all I did was I took this and put it in for the square root of 48. And so this was my final answer. Number 9. Okay. First of all, I have to subtract 43 from both sides. So that I get x squared plus 12x equals negative 43. Take the 12, divide by 2, 6, square it, 36. Add it in. X squared plus 12x plus 36 equals negative 43 plus 36. Factor. X plus 6 squared equals negative 7. This is probably going to be a little bit different because of the negative 7. Square root both sides, and I get x plus 6 equals the square root of negative 7. Remember, when you have a negative underneath the square root symbol, we have a complex number. We have imaginary numbers. So when I split this up, remember that should be both plus and minus. I'll move it up a little bit. I'm going to get x plus 6 equals square root of negative 7, and x plus 6 equals square root of negative 7. Square root of negative 7 can be split up into the square root of negative 1 and 7. Remember, the square root of a negative 1 is always I, and leave it as the square root of 7. So here I'm going to subtract 6 from both sides, and I'm left with x equals negative 6 plus I square root of 7. And over here, I'm going to subtract the 6, so that I'm left with x equals negative 6 minus I square root of 7. Okay, one more example. Number 10. So far, my numbers are in the order they should be. Or are they? They look like it, but what's wrong? My x is here, and I have no x here. So my numbers are flip-flopped. So what should be done is the first step is to subtract the 16x over here, so that I get 4x minus 16x plus 76 equals 0. Now move the 76 to the other side. Subtract 76. So that I get 4x, and that should be squared, minus 16x equals negative 76. Now it's set up the way it needs to. So now take negative 16, divide by 2, negative 8, square it, I get 64. 4x squared minus 16x plus 64 equals negative 76 plus 64. Factor, and I get x minus 8 squared equals negative 12. And if you have been paying any type of attention to this video, you just realized I did number 10 wrong. Okay? Up to a point. So up to this point right here, I skipped a step. The step that I skipped was to divide everything by my leading number. So it should have been x squared minus 4x equals negative 19. Now I take the negative 4, divide by 2. Negative 2 squared is 4. Plug it back in and add it to 4 to both sides. Factor. And this is what I've been given so far. Square root both sides. And I get x minus 2 equals plus or minus the square root of 15. Now, if you're thinking, square root of 15 cannot simplify. There is no perfect squares that will go into 15. But because it's a negative 15, an I has to come out. So I'm going to have x minus 2 equals square root of negative 15. X minus 2 equals negative square root of negative 15. So I add 2 to both sides. The negative pulls out and becomes an I. So I'm going to have 2 plus I square root of 15. And the same thing over here. I'm going to have x equals 2 minus I square root of 15. That skipped really bad. I'm going to try to rewrite that. 2 minus I square root of 15. That skipped really bad. I don't know why it's skipping. So that these are my final answer. There again, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand and ask. And if you need to go back and review any of this video, feel free.